All right, welcome to the deep dive. You
Mhm.
guys sent in some really interesting stuff this week, and I'm really excited to dig into this one.
Yeah,
This is going to be good.
I'm excited for this one too.
So we are diving into a concept. It's a really powerful one, I think. It's this idea of being broken
Yeah.
and how that brokenness can actually lead to like restoration and even purpose. You sent in this podcast script called Broken Pieces Masterpiece, God's Restoration.
Yeah.
It really tackles this concept head on through this really interesting faith-based lens.
Mm-hmm.
Our mission is to explore that journey of going from feeling totally shattered by like life's challenges, like heartbreak, loss, failure, to seeing the potential for something new to emerge, something meaningful. Really, this is for anyone who has ever felt like they have hit rock bottom, like
Mm,
a point of no return.
right. Yeah. And what really struck me, I think, when I was looking at this podcast script is just like how real and raw it is, like just the honesty. It addresses this experience that I think is so universal. Everyone at some point feels this weight of being broken. And this source, it offers a particular framework. It's really rooted in faith.
Right.
For understanding, that feeling and navigating towards healing. So we'll be extracting those core ideas from the podcast script, and we're really going to unpack this journey for you.
All right, cool. So let's get into it. The podcast script starts right there,
Okay.
right in that difficult place,
Uh-huh.
acknowledging that moment when life just feels fractured.
Right.
Maybe a relationship is ended, or you've had a job loss, or maybe there's just a mistake that feels monumental.
Right.
It just feels huge. And it asks a question that I think so many of us have wrestled with in those moments. It's like, am I too broken? Like too damaged to actually even be used for anything worthwhile?
Yeah.
It's a vulnerable question.
It is a vulnerable question. And I think what's so significant is that the podcast script immediately counters that feeling of being beyond hope, by bringing in Psalm 34.18, which says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." You know what's so fascinating here
Yeah.
for you to consider is that emphasis on God's closeness. It's precisely when we might feel most alone, most distant from everything, even a sense of the divine.
Right.
It flips that feeling of isolation in suffering completely on its head,
Yeah.
and suggests that's when that presence is actually the most acute.
That is a powerful shift in perspective. It's not about God being somewhere far off,
Right.
observing our struggles,
Yeah.
but it's this idea of God actively drawing closer. I love that.
Yeah.
The script then moves to this really vivid image. It's the potter and the clay from Jeremiah 18. I love that image. Can you help us understand how that ancient analogy speaks to this modern feeling of brokenness?
Yeah, totally. So the Old Testament, in that passage, it describes this potter, working with clay, and it becomes flawed, as he's working on it in his hands. Now, the crucial point here is that the potter doesn't throw it away in frustration.
Right.
He takes that same marred clay and he reshapes it
Mm-hmm.
into this different vessel, one that seems best to him.
Yeah.
If we connect this to what you might be feeling, that sense of being messed up or shattered even.
Right.
The analogy suggests that even in our flawed state, in our marred state, we are not discarded by God, and we're not beyond hope in God's eyes. Think about a time when you were trying to achieve something
Okay.
and it didn't go as planned. This analogy is suggesting that even when your project feels ruined, there's still potential for it to be reshaped into something valuable, even more valuable. Those broken pieces, as the script emphasizes, still have so much potential in the right hands.
Yeah. It's so encouraging, I think, to think that even when we feel like we are a complete mess,
Yeah.
that there's still this master craftsman who sees something there, some potential for something new. And then the script takes us to the story of Peter denying Jesus in Luke 22.
Right.
That is such a human moment of intense failure. I can only imagine the guilt and shame Peter must have felt.
Yeah. I mean, it's a profoundly human story. I think all the more impactful because Peter was so central to Jesus' inner circle. I mean, his denial wasn't just a minor lapse. This was a significant betrayal of someone he so deeply cared about and believed in. And, the scripture even tells us he went away and wept bitterly.
Yeah.
This wasn't just disappointment. I mean, this was likely a complete shattering of his own self-image
Right.
and his understanding of his relationship with Jesus.
And that could have been the end of Peter's story.
Right.
He could have just disappeared, consumed by that failure. But the script highlights that it wasn't. It wasn't the end. Fast forward to John 21, and we see this incredibly tender scene of restoration, where Jesus asks Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" It's almost as if Jesus is directly addressing each instance of Peter's denial with an affirmation of love and a renewal of his calling.
Yeah, precisely. And this raises, I think, a really important question for you to consider. Like, why include this seemingly devastating failure in Peter's story and then shine a light on his eventual restoration? The podcast script astutely draws a direct parallel to the feelings of failure you yourself might be experiencing.
Yeah.
Like, it's a powerful reassurance that even after significant mistakes or what feel like complete disqualifications, your story is not necessarily over. There's always potential for redemption and for continued purpose.
It's that persistent message of hope that really resonates with me. The script builds on that with these beautiful words from Isaiah 61:3. This promise of a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair.
Yeah.
That imagery is so powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And what's so fascinating here, I think, is the active and transformative nature of that promise. It's not just about things going back to some, semblance of normal. It's about a genuine exchange. Like beauty taking the place of ashes, joy replacing mourning. This emphasizes that, the divine doesn't just patch things up superficially.
Right.
There's a deep, profound restoration at work, offering something truly beautiful in those very places where there was once pain and loss.
It's like a profound upgrade.
Yeah.
And it's such a vital reminder for those of us who look at our lives and think, this isn't how it was supposed to be.
Right.
The script gently suggests that those current endings, those moments of disappointment, might actually be the very beginnings of something new and unexpected.
Yeah, I love that.
And then it introduces this concept of kintsugi, which I found so incredibly moving.
Yes.
Can you explain that art form and how it connects to this idea of restoration?
Yeah, absolutely. So kintsugi is a traditional Japanese art form where broken pottery is repaired using lacquer that's mixed with powdered gold or other precious metals. The philosophy behind it is that the history of an object, including its breaks and repairs, is part of its beauty. And that should be highlighted, not concealed. What's so insightful here is how the podcast script connects this directly to your own life. Your scars, your moments of brokenness, aren't meant to be hidden away in shame. They are acknowledged and made precious by grace. They become integral parts of your story, visible testaments to resilience and the power of healing. I think the powerful takeaway here is that your healed wounds, those aren't imperfections to hide. They are visible testaments to a stronger, more resilient whole.
Oh, I love that so much.
Yeah.
It reframes how we see our own vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to pretend we are unbroken, we can see those cracks as places where something beautiful and strong has emerged. And then the script really tackles that feeling that so many of us have. I'm just too far gone. I'm too messed up for anything good to come out of my life. By bringing in 2 Corinthians 12:9, which says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness."
This, I think, is such a pivotal point in the discussion. This verse directly challenges this, I think, common misconception that strength and flawlessness are prerequisites for being used for a greater purpose. Instead, it proposes the very opposite. That it's often in acknowledging our weaknesses that a greater power can truly manifest.
Yeah.
The podcast script then really powerfully reinforces this by offering specific examples of individuals throughout history who, by conventional standards, were quite unqualified for the significant roles they played.
Right. Like
Yeah.
Moses, who struggled with public speaking. David, whose failures were very public, very significant. Rahab, with her past. And even Paul, who went from actively persecuting the early Christians to becoming one of its most influential figures. These weren't perfect individuals. They were deeply flawed people whom, God used in remarkable ways.
Yeah.
What stands out to you when you consider these examples, in relation to our own feelings of inadequacy?
What's so striking, I think, is the sheer diversity of their shortcomings. Moses doubted his ability to communicate. David made serious moral errors. Rahab had a past that could have very easily disqualified her. And Paul's early actions were in direct opposition to his later calling.
Right.
It really underscores this idea that the criteria for being used for good often looks so different from human standards. And there's such an immense encouragement here for you, the listener. No matter what your past is, your present struggles, to know that those things don't necessarily disqualify you from future purpose.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If those individuals, with their very real and significant flaws, can be used in such impactful ways, it really opens up the possibilities for all of us. And the script even includes this personal reflection from the host, like a moment of them sharing their own experience, feeling broken, and how that season ultimately led to something good. Even though we don't have the specifics here, why is that element of personal storytelling so important when we are talking about these kinds of vulnerable experiences?
Sharing personal experiences is so powerful because it takes these abstract ideas and grounds them in the reality of human life. It allows you, the listener, to connect with the speaker on a deeper level, to see that these aren't just theoretical concepts, but that these are actually lived and experienced truths. It fosters a sense of empathy and, crucially, hope,
Yeah.
demonstrating that this journey from brokenness to healing to purpose is real and it's tangible,
Right.
and that others have walked it.
It makes it feel so much more real and attainable.
Right.
Like, okay, if they went through something difficult and found healing and meaning, maybe I can too.
Yeah.
And then the script moves into some like really practical steps,
Yeah.
like concrete actions we can take to actually surrender these broken parts of ourselves. Can you walk us through those 4 steps?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first step is to acknowledge the brokenness. The script, I think, rightly emphasizes that true healing begins with honesty. Honestly facing our pain, our disappointments, and our struggles, without denial or minimization. The second step is to trust the process. And this recognizes that the journey of healing and restoration, it isn't always linear or easy to understand. It requires a fundamental trust that even when things feel unclear or uncomfortable, there is a larger purpose at work.
Yeah.
The third step is to stay in his hands, which uses this really powerful image, I think, of the clay being molded by the potter.
Yeah.
It's an encouragement to not resist the shaping process,
Right.
even when it's challenging or painful.
Right.
And then finally, the fourth step is to let him use your story. This highlights the idea that your experiences, including the difficult ones and the subsequent healing, can become a source of comfort and encouragement and hope for others who are going through similar situations.
Those are such practical and actionable steps. It moves beyond just thinking about these ideas into actually engaging with them in our daily lives. And the script beautifully concludes with a thought from Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose.
You know, this verse offers such a powerful and overarching perspective. It suggests that even within the messiness and the brokenness of life, there's a larger design at play, and that everything, even the painful and confusing parts, can ultimately be used for good for those who trust in that process.
Yeah. It's the ultimate message of hope,
Yeah.
right? That those moments when we feel like we hit rock bottom, they're not the final chapter. And that in the hands of something greater than ourselves, those shattered pieces can be brought together to form something beautiful, something that has purpose, even a masterpiece. So as we conclude this deep dive into this encouraging podcast script, what's one final thought you'd offer our listeners, something for them to take away and consider?
Yeah. You know, I think building on that idea of letting God use your story, as the source material encourages, I would invite you to reflect on a specific broken piece in your own life right now. Is there a pain, a failure, or a disappointment that you've been holding on to, perhaps feeling defined by it? You know, consider this possibility of entrusting that piece, that experience, to a larger purpose. Instead of seeing it as a permanent flaw, could you begin to see it as potential raw material in a process of ongoing restoration? What might it look like for you to truly surrender that broken piece to a greater hand? And trust that even this can be woven into something ultimately good and meaningful.
That is a really powerful and challenging invitation. It's not always easy to release those painful parts of our story, but the possibility of them becoming integral to a larger, more beautiful narrative is something worth considering. Thank you for taking this deep dive with me into this encouraging message of faith and restoration. It's a potent reminder that even in our deepest vulnerabilities, there is incredible potential for transformation and hope.